Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock, episode 200, and it just happens to be a Patreon one. Now, I took stock of the various comments that everyone made about splitting the Patreon Drydock across 2 weeks, or keeping it all as one long one, etc, etc. And the balance of it seems to be that slightly more people prefer it in a single week, for a variety of reasons, which is understandable. But also a fair number of you point out that the timestamps on them, once you get past about 2.5, 3 hours in, they kind of disappear. They don't entirely disappear. There are timestamps in the pinned comment. However, YouTube's video description, which is where obviously I have to put all the timestamps with the questions, that has a 5,000 character limit, which gets maxed out by about 2.5, 3 hours of questions, hence why the rest of them have to go in the pinned post, which of course YouTube itself doesn't pick up. Although obviously you can click on them. Now, therefore, I'm going to propose a version that kind of is hopefully the best of both worlds, and we'll see how that goes this month. If people like it, then great, and we'll continue that way, which is you'll still get the Patreon Drydock in a single week, but I'll split it into A and B sections with an effort to try and therefore obviously get all the questions in timestamps, and then you'll just have 200 part A and 200 part B releasing a couple of hours apart on the same day. And for those of you who like to listen to, a nice big block of Drydock while you're driving or something, I'll try and figure out if I can include an auto run on at the end credits, straight into the next one, and hopefully that will work. So, with all that said and done, let's get on with the questions. Trevor Polasek asks, a few years ago I was transcribing the oral history interview of a sailor named Philip Dillaway, a student of New York Maritime Academy during World War II, where he mentioned a rumour about the superintendent of the college, Vice Admiral Thomas Tingley Craven. The rumour went that he had bought a fictitious bomb aboard the USS Maine, presumably BB-10, and left it outside the magazines, then gone up and told the captain about it. I was always curious as to whether or not this rumour was true. Can you shed some light on where the rumour may have come from, and if these sorts of drills were ever carried out to test ship security in any navy? Now, I can't speak to the precise veracity of that particular rumour, but it would not surprise me in the slightest. Bearing in mind, in the recent video on the first 7 US Navy fleet problems, for example, the USS New York got quote-unquote blown up by somebody who physically climbed aboard the ship using a mooring line while it was transiting the Panama Canal, and managed to get all the way into the ship's magazines and, for exercise purposes, set off a bomb, thus destroying the ship. So if that's a kind of security issue they're having in the 1920s, then an issue which presumably is going to be happening in the 1910s, maybe the late 1900s, it would be entirely believable. The thing is, you've got to bear in mind that prior to things like, pass keys and facial recognition technology, all the stuff we have these days, and much wider security on military bases as well, it's actually, in the past, relatively easy to sneak aboard a ship as long as you can get past that first bit of actually physically getting onto the ship. And obviously, being a naval officer, even base security wouldn't have challenged him up to the point that he got onto the ship. And, okay, obviously there are officers of the watch and guards, etc., who are monitoring where the ship's supposed access points are, where the gangways are. But as the guy who sneaked aboard the New York and the Panama Canal proved, there are other ways of getting up a ship, and all it takes is someone not being entirely vigilant, or someone being just a little bit busy, or even the light or some stack of boxes or something getting in the way. And once you're on the ship, if you're in uniform, people will tend to assume you are supposed to be on the ship, especially if you walk with a purpose. I mean, it's the whole thing of, carry a clipboard and a high-vis jacket and you can probably walk into almost anywhere. Or a sack barrow with a bunch of printer paper if you go into offices and so forth. It's just a piece of human psychology, and you can't expect the crew to recognise everybody who's supposed to be there. I mean, Maine BB-10 had about 550 to 570 officers and men aboard, depending on the exact time of year. And, you know, if you've regularly been to big events, whether they be, you know, cons or whatever, that might have an attendance of 400 to 500, even if you see the same people for 3 or 4 days constantly during a year in a single large space, you might recognise some, but you're not going to recognise all. And of course, on a battleship, you're not in a big open space. So the engineering crew might recognise their own guys from the shift of engineering and a few people from nearby and a couple of others they might get on with. But any individual person is probably only likely to actually know immediately by facial recognition, maybe several dozen people on the ship, maybe pushing up to 100 if that. But that still leaves, you know, 80% of the crew are just, they're human-shaped objects who happen to have some kind of rank or not, as the case may be. And so if you see someone, you know, striding with a purpose, possibly wearing some kind of gold braid that means they're a higher rank than you, which, and then, you know, heading down for the ship's magazine, well, you're probably not going to interfere. You assume, oh, okay, I guess he's doing that. And yeah, it would be entirely possible for that kind of thing to happen. As far as whether drills were carried out to test ship security in navies, yes, periodically on and off, for pretty much as long as ships were worth securing, there were security drills. So the frequency of them and their effectiveness is another matter entirely, obviously, but they were carried out. And incidents like this, obviously there was also the incident where the fake emperor managed to get aboard HMAS Dreadnought and so on and so forth. All of these would lead to big revisions and usually a spate of exercises. These days, it's slightly harder to get aboard a warship without authorization, in no small part, to be perfectly honest. Apart from the base security issues, there's also just the fact that warships, for the most part these days, tend to be slightly larger than their World War I or pre-World War I or interwar counterparts, with a few exceptions. And so the physical challenge of getting aboard anywhere that's not the designated access way is a much greater. Art Brogden asks, what was the impact of the Greece and Crete intervention, bearing in mind Royal Navy losses, on the Japanese Navy's decision to go south and the subsequent ABDA composition to oppose them? Well, it certainly didn't help. The Royal Navy lost multiple cruisers and even more destroyers during the operations, well, the failed intervention in Greece and then, of course, falling back to Crete, and then the evacuation from Crete, the Battle of Crete, of course, being very, very costly in terms of ships lost for the Royal Navy. However, that has to be mitigated against when you consider the Japanese decision-making, with the fact that the Battle of Crete was over by early June 1941, which is a fair time from, well, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, let alone the Japanese advance south in early 42 that necessitated ABDA command be formed to stop them. There were also other ships that were damaged. Obviously, many more ships were damaged than were sunk, but even the ones that needed quite extensive repairs were back in service for the most part before the end of 1941. Now, that's not to say that the losses didn't hurt the Royal Navy, and if they'd had those ships around in early 42, then no doubt some of them probably would have been sent to the Far East to help bulk up the initial response. The flip side to that is, of course, that with 6-7 months between the two incidents, it's difficult to say what state the ships that were lost would have been in or where they would have been. If the Cunningham had had more ships through 41 in the Mediterranean, could he have changed the tide of battle somewhat? Would some of the convoys have been more successful? Would some of those ships have been damaged or sunk anyway? Would some of those ships have been sent off to other operational theatres? 6 months in World War II is a huge amount of time, so apart from just not having as many ships, and therefore theoretically somewhat fewer ships being available for the war in the Far East, it's very difficult to say what, if any, effect that had. It may be that maybe the Royal Navy wouldn't send anything further out anyway, because obviously those ships were assigned to the Mediterranean for a reason, and it's not like the Mediterranean theatre was going to let up in late 41 and early 42 anyway. So I suspect that it probably wouldn't have altered the balance of forces with ABDA command all that much. Maybe there might have been a cruiser and maybe 3 or 4 more destroyers present. The larger issue, however, is the fact that even when you add up all of ABDA command ships, and I don't just mean the full fleet that Admiral Doorman was able to put together, I mean if you add together all the ships that were notionally under ABDA's command when the Japanese came calling, the Japanese war plan had anticipated somewhat more than that being available just for the Royal Navy to call on, and they'd cut their cloth accordingly in terms of the ships that they assigned. They then obviously were able to roll that back a little bit, split their forces up to cover more ground and do more things at once when they realised actually that isn't going to be the case. But the Japanese campaign in 1942 heading south, at least in the southwestern Pacific, is a relatively good example in the first few months of expect the worst, hope for the best, and you'll probably get through. Because the Japanese came on in a force that, with any realistic amount of deviation from the historical timeline, assuming that the losses off of Greece and Crete didn't happen, wouldn't be in the slightest position to stop. About the only thing that might change would be that potentially 1 or 2 more ships would be available for the for earlier deployment with Force Z, and whether or not that makes any difference at all, obviously that's going down a Force Z alt history derivative. But for example, a relatively, I say relatively speaking, compared to a Town class or a Crown Colony class cruiser, but a relatively less important vessel would be something like the Calcutta. So it was a C-class cruiser that had been refitted into an anti-aircraft cruiser equipped with lots of twin 4-inch. Now, you could argue, well, it was an anti-aircraft cruiser that then got sunk by air attack, so how could it be any good? But to be fair, Calcutta did an awfully good job generally, seeing off various air attacks as best it could until it was surprised by bombers coming out of the sun. So, you could throw in, well, what if there was a small dedicated anti-aircraft cruiser operating with Repulse and Prince of Wales? Could that have made a difference? Entirely possible, but who knows? And this is the thing. I don't think the Battle of Crete, in and of itself, as well as the Greek intervention, offers enough losses for them not happening to tip the balance in 1942 in the Western Pacific, for certain. But maybe, just maybe, 1 or 2 ships here or there might tip the balance of certain key battles or events, and then who knows where that might lead. Pendon Harley asks, the unofficial accolade the Blue Riband was given to the ocean liner making the fastest transatlantic crossing, a journey of nearly 3,000 nautical miles. Brunel's SS Great Western made the crossing at an average speed of around 10 knots in 1840, the SS City of Paris averaged 20 knots in 1890, RMS Lusitania held 24 knots in 1907, Mauretania 26 in 1909, Queen Mary about 30 knots in 1936, and SS United States about 35 knots in 1952. During this time, there were always warships with higher top speeds than these great ocean liners, but were there warships that had the power, fuel capacity, and mechanical reliability to make the 3,000-mile crossing at a higher average speed than ocean liners of the same time period? For example, could HMS Tiger have bested Mauretania's 26-knot crossing at commissioning, or would she have run out of fuel just before making New York? And what factors made this a difficult feat for warships to achieve? Mechanically, there's nothing to stop a warship getting a Blue Riband, I suppose if they're carrying a couple of passengers or something, or equivalent thereof, and as you mentioned, broadly speaking, most of the time there were warships that were faster than the ocean liners. But in terms of actually fulfilling it, there is a much larger issue than mechanical reliability, which wasn't necessarily going to be too much of a problem. It's the fuel capacity. Now, Tiger wouldn't have managed to beat Mauritania doing 26 knots because Tiger could do the transatlantic crossing at 24 knots, just about, with a tiny reserve of fuel, but not 26. And this was one of the problems that the Royal Navy encountered in World War I, because they'd paid for a lot of these liners to be fitted with strong points so that they could be turned into armed merchant cruisers pretty quickly. And such was done. The problem was the big ones, like Olympic, Mauritania, Lusitania, etc. It turned out the reason that they could sustain such high speeds for such long distances was they had massively outsized amounts of fuel aboard. So their bunkers ran so deep that they could sustain an incredibly high speed across the Atlantic. Warships couldn't afford that luxury. They had a lot of other things they needed to devote weight to, like armour and so forth. And so, for the most part, no, a warship would be able to outpace an ocean liner. Well, a fast warship, like a battle cruiser or a cruiser or a destroyer, would be able to outpace an ocean liner for a certain amount of time, but then it would run out of fuel and the ocean liner wouldn't. And the massive amount of fuel consumption that the ocean liners actually used was one of the reasons why they were, the big ones at least, were fairly quickly disarmed and returned to service as troop transports or whatever, because they were far too expensive to run, even for the Royal Navy in wartime. Now, the only ships that could conceivably reliably pull off beating an ocean liner across the Atlantic would probably be the Iowas, to be honest, because even cruisers designed to obviously cruise at long range were designed to cruise at long range at slower speeds with a high burst speed. Again, just not enough fuel bunkerage. The Iowas could do the transatlantic crossing at full pelt, and so an Iowa in the early 1940s, late 1940s, would be able to comfortably take an unofficial Blue Riband off of the Queen Mary, and that's because obviously the Iowas are unique in that they're designed for exceptionally high speed, but they are also exceptionally sized, and thus able to keep up that speed for a prolonged period of time because the US battleships are designed for maximum possible range. And before anyone asks, no, HMS Hood did not have the fuel capacity on her efficiency of early 1920s engines to make that journey either. Texas Anla Shock asks, with the recent situation aboard USS The Sullivans, I started wondering, are museum ships basically living on borrowed time? Will they eventually reach a point where the slow process of time will outstrip any efforts to keep them watertight and structurally sound? I don't think so. As long as proper care is taken of them, even a steel ship's structural elements, the keel, the framing, etc., should stay in pretty good nick for, arbitrary amounts of time. The main thing you have to worry about with steel ships, and, well, to be honest, with wooden ships as well, is your outer hull. So the hull plating on wooden ships, the the outer hull plating on steel ships, the planking on the wood ships. And in some ways, wooden ships have a slight advantage over the steel ships. One, because obviously wooden ships tend to be a lot smaller, so they don't cost as much to upkeep. Secondly, wood, because of the fact that it rots, the hulls were built fairly thick, so you can assess a hull fairly easily, even visually, if not even by diving. And if the outer layers of wood are a spongy mess, you're like, oh, okay, right, we need to replank this thing. But you can do that before it's gotten to the inner layers of the ship's planking and thus starting to cause you major problems. Again, assuming that your maintenance schedule and funding allows for this. And, of course, you can also do localized repairs on a wooden ship that relies on stripping away outer planking and replacing it a lot easier than you can with a ship that has steel panels that need to be unbolted, unriveted, or unwelded, or cut through, or whatever. So wooden ships do have an advantage there, but even with steel ships, again, it's a matter of can the museum or whatever organisation is running the ship, can they afford to dry dock it, to clean it, scrape it, paint it, replace where necessary panels that might have become a bit too rusted through. You do start to get into ship of Theseus arguments, but to be honest, replacing the outer hull plates and the decking is something that navies would have to do as part of maintenance anyway over time, so that doesn't really, I think, lock into the whole ship of Theseus argument. But what it will do is it will become exponentially more expensive over time, up to a certain point, because obviously if you receive a ship as a museum vessel, and hopefully the Navy that's giving it to you is taking relatively good care of it, then for the first 10, 15, 20, 30 years, you do general maintenance and upkeep, maybe replace a deck here and there, patch a few little holes in the superstructure, and it's all fine. But then at some point, eventually, you are going to have to dry dock that thing and do some major repairs, and that will be very expensive. And then, however long down the line, 25, 30 years later, you can have to do it again, and so on and so forth. And the big worry, I think, for museum ships will be the fact, not so much that it can't be done, but the fact that the sheer expense of what it costs to get it done quite often can mean that ships are either forced to, or sometimes feel like they have to, put off that maintenance for as long as possible, which actually a lot of the time only ends up making the situation worse. But sometimes it's out of their control. If they don't have the money granted to them that year, then there's not a lot they can do. Miko Leitner asks, do the minutes and draft agendas of the naval conferences, Washington, London, Versailles Peace Treaty, etc., exist publicly? aka, is it possible to follow the meetings via them and get to know the specific route it took to finalise the treaties? Qualified, yes, in the sense that you can access them, but as far as I'm aware, they're not public domain, as in you can look them up on the internet. Some, like Versailles, the documents are in various national archives, so you can just go and request them. Others may be in the national archives of the various countries in question. I don't know. I haven't really looked for the minutes and agendas of London and Washington within the archives. They're probably there somewhere. Someone has to be keeping them. But the reason I haven't looked in the archives for them is because, at least in the UK, the notes and documents from those conferences were actually published by the government at the time. So at that point, you can either get in contact in the UK with Her Majesty's Stationery Office, who originally published them, or their successor, whoever they happen to be, or you can get lucky and find a copy of them in an old bookshop or something like that. But basically they exist in some kind of paid book form. And of course, since it is, well, the guys in the HM Stationery Office probably had been in the role since the 19th century. For example, the London Naval Conference book, which has all the papers that you might ever want to know about the conference, has the following wonderful title, very 19th century. Documents of the London Naval Conference 1930, consisting of the treaty signed on April 22nd, the minutes of the plenary meetings, memoranda submitted by the United States, French, United Kingdom, Italian, Japanese delegations of their position at the conference, report of the First Committee, letter addressed to the President of the Conference, to the Secretary General of the League of Nations on April 21st, 1930, Foreign Office. So yeah. If you want to see all the minutes of the meetings, all the various proposals and counter-proposals, reports and so forth for the London Naval Conference, that's available somewhere. Yeah, my copy's a little bit dog-eared and large. Matt Kidd asks, according to Wikipedia, Iowa transported Roosevelt, Secretary of State Hull, Admirals Leahy and King, Generals Marshall, Arnold and Hopkins, all to Mers El Kabir. How many VIP quarters did Iowa have? Did King and Marshall have to bunk together? Did the captain have to bunk with the junior officers? So Iowa was fitted out as a fleet flagship, so she had somewhat more quarters aboard her for this kind of thing than some of the other ships did. And so I suspect what happened is that the various guests were all put up collectively in the Admiral's suite, i.e. the suite that's designed for the Admiral, and all of his staff. So, I mean, obviously, Roosevelt had to, for medical reasons, had to have his own special arrangements made, but I suspect everybody else was basically given, one of you will get the Admiral's stateroom, another one of you will get the Admiral's day cabin, another one of you will get the Admiral's flag officer's cabin, and so on and so forth, until, well, given that Admiral staffs could run into dozen plus, and there weren't a dozen plus dignitaries, even though it was quite a high concentration of dignitaries, they probably would have all fitted quite nicely, even if perhaps one or two of them might have had to put up with quarters that were a little bit smaller than they were perhaps used to at the time of their rank. This voyage also, incidentally, is the one where the famous torpedo incident with the USS William D. Porter occurred. So if you look through the Roosevelt Presidential Library and look at the diary for that particular day, bearing in mind the guest list, as the question just enunciated, the transcript for November 14th, 1943 says, at 8 a.m, noted position and weather conditions, air defense drill exercised for FDR demonstrating ship's firepower. During the drill, unexpected explosion occurred in vicinity of USS Iowa, discovered to be a torpedo accidentally fired by USS William D. Porter, the anti-submarine screen to starboard, probably caused by moisture from rough seas. Investigation ordered by Admiral Ernest J. King. Really? I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that one. In afternoon, inspections of ship's medical department conducted. Now, I know it's probably just coincidence, but I love the juxtaposition of those two lines and the implications that, yes, once Admiral King learned he had almost been accidentally torpedoed, maybe they needed to make sure the ship's medical facilities weren't completely overwhelmed by the end of the day. Ferris asks, in his accounting of his time aboard Wahoo and Tang, Richard O'Kane recalls his preferred doctrine of torpedo firing and how it differed from the standard US Navy doctrine. To wit, if he was firing multiple torpedoes at a target, he would take bearings for each individual torpedo to hit a specific point at an enemy vessel. According to him, the standard doctrine would be to take one bearing and add a spread of a few degrees to either side. My question is, for other large navies, Britain, Germany, Japan, etc., did they have a preferred torpedo aiming doctrine? And if so, did any of their sub-captains break with that doctrine to their benefit? So, it's a very broad question, and probably, to be perfectly honest, would need its own Wednesday video to fully discuss, because yes, every navy had their own preferred torpedo firing doctrine, which they would instruct their captains in, but simultaneously there were a number of variants to each of those patterns for the most part, and what pattern was the most optimal depended on a situation by situation basis. So, for example, you could fire a spread like you're talking about, where you fire torpedoes at multiple different angles. Obviously, if you're very confident that your angle is correct, then you would fire like O'Kane did, by effectively aiming to hit at multiple points along the hull. If you were less confident of your aim, then you could fire on a degree bearing spread. So if you think, well, I think this is going to work, but I'm not entirely confident on the range solution that either my calculations, or if you're in the US, your torpedo data computer is generated, then, add a degree or two to each subsequent torpedo and hope that one of them is somewhat correct. This is also going to vary depending on range, because of course a 2-degree, say, difference in bearing for your torpedoes at close range might actually be less than the distance between your targets amidships and bow or stern, whereas at very long range that might be enough distance that the ship could pass between the two torpedoes, even if it doesn't realise that they're there. And then you have, your doctrine for attacking merchant ships, which usually favours a single torpedo. So the Germans obviously went in for that for quite a bit, and that's mainly to conserve torpedoes because they've got a lot of different targets and a lot of time out at sea. Whereas at the other extreme, you have something like the T-class, the British T-class fleet submarine, and its firing doctrine for encountering large numbers of enemy warships, or very high-value target enemy warships, which is to fire an entire forward spread of 10, including external tubes that are very difficult to reload while out at sea, and hope for the best, the shotgun spread approach, and everything in between. And at different points, at different times, different captains would either use a anti-warship spread against a merchant ship, or use a merchant ship approach against a warship, or their own inventive ideas at various points. So I guess the answer is yes, each navy did have its own preferred torpedo aiming doctrine, but that was a relatively extensive document. Normally, the other thing you could also do is obviously fire multiple torpedoes down the same bearing, one after the other, if you were confident on the bearing but thought your timing might be slightly off. But as to which captains broke with their doctrines to which benefits for which incidents, that would be an incredibly long and complicated answer, except to say that yes, they actually did that on occasion. Joe Brown asks, I recall reading that at the Battle of Denmark Strait, Admiral Holland could have integrated the fire control for his two capital ships using Prince of Wales's newer optics and computers to direct Hood's fire as well. Can you explain how integrated fire control would have worked in practice, and was there a serious drawback that explains Holland's decision not to try it? So the idea of integrated fire control was not a new one. It had been tried and used with the degree of success by the Russians in World War I against Goeben. The idea is basically, as you mentioned, one ship, whether it to be the lead ship, the ship with the best fire control, fire control men aboard, would calculate the range and bearing, and they would then transmit that to all the other ships. In World War I, you could do that visually. In World War II, I suppose you could also have done it by radio. And then as long as the following vessel, or leading vessel, I guess, knows the relative difference between their position and the ship that's generating the data's position, then they can make the necessary adjustments for their own fire, and theoretically everybody is firing at the same point. So that's good. However, there are a couple of problems with the idea of applying it to the Battle of the Denmark Strait. First of all, for obvious reasons, it works best when everybody is sailing in a nice neat line, and ideally the enemy is doing you the courtesy of also sailing in a nice neat line. If you are manoeuvring, and your enemy is possibly either manoeuvring or on a closing or parting course, it makes everything a lot more complex to calculate, which in turn means you'd have to pass on a lot more information, and or you could pass on some basic information and let the other ship's observations fill in the details, but then at that point, what's the point of passing on partial information? So, and given that in the circumstances they were on a closing course, but with a series of 20-degree turns to port being executed, it would have been a rather complex thing to do. Secondly, the other problem is it assumes you're all shooting at the same target, whereas Holland's plan, at least, was for Hood and Prince of Wales to engage separate targets. So Prince of Wales passing its target data onto Hood would have been entirely useless for Hood firing at its own target. If Hood had been firing at Prince of Wales's target, then it might have made a bit more sense, but that, as I said, wasn't the plan, even though, actually, ironically enough, initially they did actually end up shooting at the same ship through cases of misidentification, but nevertheless, it was also the wrong ship. So yeah, there were a number of good reasons not to try in that particular circumstance. Now, if things had been slightly different, if, let's say, Prince of Wales or Hood had managed to get a signal off to Norfolk or Suffolk a little bit earlier, Norfolk or Suffolk had begun their run-in a little bit earlier, and then the two counties had taken Prince Eugen under fire, and maybe specifically identified this is Prince Eugen, this is Bismarck, and sent that back to Holland. So then Holland's going into the engagement knowing, A, which ship is which, and B, that Prince Eugen is being engaged elsewhere. Then at that point, it may have become more attractive to use integrated fire if indeed he thought about it. Although, again, the manoeuvring element would have caused some potential issues there, but it would become a more likely scenario at that point, as opposed to, the situation as it actually stood. Brian Roper asks, we're all aware of the inadequacies of the Mark 14 torpedo. However, my question is, based on the known instances of malfunctioning torpedoes, which single torpedo or torpedo attack could have had the greatest impact of the war had the torpedoes functioned properly? Well, there are so many instances of torpedoes not working properly that we could be here all day picking our favourites. But in light of what it was going to accomplish, then one of my two top picks would be the German torpedoes that were fired at HMS Warspite as she entered Narvik. They all failed. And, well, if they'd crippled or sunk Warspite, well, one, the Warspite's attack at Narvik obviously was not going to succeed at that point, but secondly, obviously Warspite is then not available for the rest of World War II, and we know how vital she was in any number of engagements in the Mediterranean, amongst others, so that would have been a fairly big impact. The other one, which kind of loops back to the Mark 14, would be the attack that USS Sargo made. Now, USS Sargo, near the beginning of the war, actually got into one of the major, if not the major, Japanese invasion convoy that was heading for the Philippines right at the beginning of the war. It fired off at least half of the torpedoes it carried. And being Mark 14s at the start of the war, of course, nothing happened. Would it stop the Japanese advance in the Pacific? No. Would it significantly delay the Japanese attack on the Philippines, thus changing a lot of the course of the early part of the Pacific War? Yup. For one thing, obviously, the Japanese troops will be drowning. For two, they're going to be a lot more cagey and careful about sending in further troop convoys, and of course, those troops and those ships are not available for further operations further forward. So it could potentially slow down the entire Japanese offensive in the Western Pacific in 1942. Brian Rederman asks, were there any warships sunk in place and used as an ad hoc coastal defence battery? Happens more often than you think, actually, both willingly and unwillingly. Back in the Age of Sail days, there were floating gun batteries, and then once they started to, fail at the floating part, some of them were towed into shallow water and allowed to sink in place, thus forming a kind of impromptu wooden coastal fort. Then in World War I, you have the example of Cadopus, albeit that she was grounded rather than completely sunk. And, this kind of thing did happen more and more, as I both in terms of ships that were deliberately voluntarily sunk in place to form coastal batteries or defences, and involuntarily when luck happened to run their way. So the picture, for example, is the German cruiser Köln, one of the Königsbergs, which was hit and sunk at the dockside in the latter part of World War II. But as you can see, she sank on an even keel and the water wasn't particularly deep, so although she wasn't going anywhere, she was able to be used as a gun battery. And the same thing happened to the Lutzow, the renamed Deutschland of the Panzerschiffs. She also was sunk but settled on an even keel and was able to continue to be used as a non-mobile artillery point. And that was eventually also going to be the fate of Tirpitz had 617 and 9 squadrons not caught up with her. Capitano Lorenzo asks, I've read that the Royal Navy adopted the Gatling gun in 1871. Indeed, there are numerous accounts of Gatling guns being used in the South African colonial wars, specifically the Zulu War of 1879, where it is reported that these Gatling guns were operated by Royal Navy personnel, reportedly from HMS Shah and perhaps other ships. Can you discuss the Royal Navy use of Gatling guns, circumstances of use, and whether they made up part of the defensive armament of Royal Navy vessels during this period? So, yeah, the Royal Navy and the British Army adopted the Gatling gun, which can make identifying who was using what a little bit difficult on surface readings, but we know for definite that naval brigades were using the Gatling gun as mentioned in the Zulu War, and also in the Egyptian campaign a little bit later on in the late 19th century. The main difference between the British Army and the Royal Navy Gatling guns was that the British Army adopted, I think it was a 42 or 45 caliber weapon. The Royal Navy went one better and got a 65 caliber version, or something close to that if I remember the figures correctly. Basically, they got a really big calibered Gatling gun because, as you may infer from this picture, the Gatling gun was not strictly designed for use on land by the naval brigades, although that was certainly a very useful and appreciated feature. What it was actually designed for was defence of ships. well, that's how the British were going to use it anyway, mounted in fighting tops where it was considerably lighter than a good many of the lighter field artillery that you might use. And unlike something like the Nordenfeldt 4-barrel guns, it was, whilst perhaps slightly heavier, certainly a lot more compact and a lot easier to wield. So the main idea for the Royal Navy was to use it as an anti-boarding or to help with boarding weapon, and also to deal with small attack craft at close range, which, ironically enough, is pretty much what Gatling guns are used for these days as well as other forms of point defence. But in the late 19th century, not too many people were all that keen on challenging the Royal Navy, and so a lot of the time men of the Royal Navy adopted a have gun will travel policy of showing up to a colonial hotspot, and if the annoying people who were rebelling against the British Empire were not within range of the ship's field artillery, i.e. its main artillery guns, then, well, anything that could be dismounted and stuck on a carriage was dismounted and stuck on a carriage, and off went the naval brigade to go and find people beyond the range of the sea which they could shoot at. And this they did, obviously, to some success in various campaigns. Jim Smitty asks, this past month, after digging around at a used bookstore, I came across a pre-release copy of the late James Hornfisher's book, Ship of Ghosts, along with a signed copy of Fortress Rebelle by Bruce Campbell. I picked up both books for a good price, and I'm looking forward to reading them. This, however, got me wondering, how rare is it to come across books like this in used bookstores? Further, have you found pre-release copies or books signed by authors by digging through used bookstores, as I did? Yes, I have, although it does depend a lot on exactly which shops you go to. So, general used bookstores, you'd be incredibly lucky to come across anything particularly relevant to our collective interest in naval history. But if you go to the right shops, you can usually find something quite fun. So this, for example, is my little hidden secret, Books Afloat in Weymouth, manned by an absolutely wonderful gentleman. And every time I go to Tankfest or I find myself in the area in Weymouth, I drop down in there, and I usually make sure, if I know I'm going to be in the area, to have a sack barrow with me, because there's going to be a lot of books coming out of there. And as he says on there, books on all subjects bought and sold, but it's primarily naval stuff. The maritime stuff takes about a third of the ground floor, and the biggest room upstairs is also maritime related, so that's all fun times for me. Now, what have I come across in there? As near as I can tell, the original manuscript for British Cruisers by Raven and Roberts. It's certainly signed by them, and a mixture of handwritten and typographic notes. It's basically the entire book, except in typographic form with lots of handwritten notes indicating changes and so forth. So I think that's either a draft or a work in progress version. How it ended up there, I don't know. I also found a copy of Admiral Cunningham's biography, signed by Admiral Cunningham, with a message in it as well. So, result, I already had a copy, but that very quickly gave way to the signed copy, for obvious reasons. Yeah, there's a few like that have come out of that shop. And of course, now that I've said that, anyone in the southwest is going to descend upon it. Oh well. Trevorius asks, I suppose this might be more geopolitical, but in any case, given that the Kiel Canal was a hugely difficult thing to build, and that it was built through the province of Schleswig-Holstein, which had at the time only very recently been conquered by the Germans from Denmark, why did the Germans decide to go through all the expense of building the Kiel Canal rather than just finishing their conquest of Denmark, which would have served the same purpose? Did Denmark go in a few decades from being a state the Germans felt they could conquer and take territory off of without issue to instead being a state that the Germans would go through great expense to avoid having to touch? And if so, then why were they willing to build a canal at great expense through territory Denmark probably wanted back? Well, for one thing, there is a difference between taking a province off of somebody by negotiating an end to a war and outright conquering them. One is considerably easier to achieve, for the most part, than the other. So there's that. Secondly, the Kiel Canal does offer a considerable shortcut compared to going all the way around Denmark. So it is, in terms of getting to and from the North Sea and the Baltic, actually a considerably better way of going, albeit obviously it was expensive to build, as you mentioned. But you have to kind of look at the trade-off of what would it cost to actually fully invade, occupy, and assimilate Denmark for the sake of, in this case of argument, for the sake of a naval passage that would actually take longer anyway, versus what's the cost of building the Kiel Canal. And in those terms, actually building the canal is cheaper. And you've also got to take into account that whilst, beating up each other's countries and trading off provinces was very much a done thing in Europe in the 19th century, just look at the trade-offs back and forth of territory between France and Germany in the Franco-Prussian War and then World War I. There was something of a difference between doing that and actually actively conquering and taking over what other people might perceive to be a old school country. So Prussia might be willing at the time, obviously Prussian War and then Germany later on, might be willing to shave a few bits off of Denmark, but they wouldn't be willing to take the risk of inviting in other people who might take objection to them taking over all of Denmark, which just escalates the cost even further. So by that, taking Schleswig-Holstein and then building the Kiel Canal was probably the cheaper of the two options, and of course, having just taken off of them, Germany being physically the much larger, much more populous country, could be fairly certain of keeping it, unless, they were to do something silly like start a world war and lose it catastrophically. In fact, I'm relatively surprised the Danes didn't ask for Schleswig-Holstein back, certainly at least after World War II. Jonathan Smith asks, Washington Naval Treaty question. When the treaty was being negotiated, did any of the contracting powers have a yard working on building a capital ship for any non-contracting power? And if so, how was that handled for the ship, the yard, and the contract? Assuming there weren't any such ships, hypothetically, do you think if there had been a contracting power building them, they might have been able to get them listed in the treaty by name and purchasing country as an exception, and thus able to be completed and delivered? Or do you think such a ship would be seen by other contracting powers as too destabilising and they'd refuse to negotiate such an exception, despite the cost that might result from breaking such a contract? For the most part, there weren't. The British obviously had been building ships for themselves during the war, and after the war, pretty much everyone was economically exhausted. No one was buying ships, and if Britain wasn't building ships, pretty much no one else would be. The Russians, of course, were in the middle of settling down after the revolution. The Germans had lost. The Italians were scrapping ships left, right and centre because their economy was having significant problems. So were the French. The Americans were, at that point, obviously in the middle of building their own ships. The South American dreadnought race had petered out. Japan was quite happily meandering along building its own capital ships. So, there wasn't really a foreign buyer's market at the time of the Washington Treaty. There were some prospective ones, especially when you looked at the ships for countries like Canada or Australia. But there were a couple of holdovers, namely the Vasilisevs Konstantinos, I think, and Salamis, basically the two Greek dreadnoughts. Now, one of them was in Germany, which was not a signatory to the Washington Treaty, but the other one was in France, based on Britannia class, and it was still technically on the stocks at the time of the Washington Treaty. The reason Almirante Latorre is present is because she was the last foreign ship to leave British yards in terms of capital ships just before the Washington Treaty negotiations began. Now, when it comes to particularly the Greek dreadnought that was in the French yard, that obviously France was a signatory power, but it was a holdover. There were contract disputes and negotiations going on with the Greek government, but there is no particular mention of that not being allowed to go through in the Washington Treaty. I think, based on that, both that circumstance and others, plus, of course, the ongoing issues with the Washington Treaty, that a yard that was working on building a capital ship already would be allowed to complete it, but that the ban was going forward, i.e. from now on, from the time of the signing of the treaty, no one would be selling and building capital ships for third-party powers. As it turned out, the Greek ship was broken up anyway, didn't go anywhere, but based on that, as I say, I think if there had been an outstanding contract where the ship was reasonably partway through construction already, then it was already a known factor going into the negotiations and it would have been allowed to proceed. What the third-party power selling ban was mostly designed to do was to stop the three big countries getting around the treaty restrictions by effectively either creating a vassal state or finding a very close ally they knew they could always count on and, quote-unquote, selling them a bunch of ships that obviously would then not be subject to the treaty limitations, which were between the signing powers only. For the most part, obviously based on who sold the most foreign ships to who, it was mostly aimed at Britain, especially considering that Britain had the closest and most reliable allies in the forms of places like Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and not a few American diplomats thought it was entirely possible that Britain might, as I say, quote-unquote, sell for like £1 or something, a bunch of ships to those navies and then, turn up with a massive fleet whenever there was a war. Randy Topeka asks, many coal-fired steamships had their bunkers located along the hull, with some warships using them as increased protection. A notable exception to this trend were the Olympic-class ships which had their bunkers along the interior bulkheads. Had Titanic had coal bunkers along the side of her hull, would this have had any effect on her sinking? Potentially. It wouldn't, I think, have stopped her sinking. We saw with the actual Titanic sinking that the coal bunker hatches were not proof against the pressure of water that built up behind them. Boiler room 5 flooding when those hatches blew. However, boiler room 6 was flooded. Bizarrely enough, on Titanic, the boiler room numbers ran from aft to forward, so boiler room 6 was the forwardmost boiler room. Anyway, so we know boiler room 6 flooded, and in part that's because the boiler room itself, the void space in which the boilers sit, was basically right next to the exterior of the hull, or the interior of the hull. If Titanic had had boilers along its sides, like on warships, for example, then, it's not going to help most of the gashes in the hull because they're all forward of the boiler rooms anyway. But for boiler room 6 and the little scratch that just about passed through into 5, they would have opened up the coal bunkers instead of opening up into the main part boiler room 6 and, well, also into a coal bunker in 5, never mind. But that may have slowed down its rate of sinking because, as I said, now the hull gashes are still the hull gashes. Those coal bunker plates, hatch plates, as we said, were not strong enough, so they would have blown eventually. However, in boiler room 5, it probably wouldn't have made much difference either way, but in boiler room 6, the initial flooding would have had to fill up the coal bunker and then exert enough pressure on the hatches to blow them to then flood boiler room 6, and the bulkheads between 5 and 6 might well have been also a little bit stronger if they didn't have coal bunkers either side of them as well, in terms of, they would have just been big solid lumps of steel with bulkhead doors on them. Obviously then once boiler room 6 floods and then eventually the hatches go on 5 and 5 floods, then the ship is doomed. However, because it would probably take a little bit longer for the ship's bow to go down, and possibly also there'd be slightly less pressure on the hatches because it would be water flowing in from the side of the ship, and once the ship stopped, that's relatively low, as opposed to historically, especially when the boiler room 5 hatches blew, where it was not just the pressure of the water coming in, it was the pressure of all the water that was flooding forward pressing on the bulkheads as well. So if in those circumstances the Titanic may have stayed afloat long enough for Carpathia to show up, or even if it didn't, it would have sunk at some point between when it historically sank and when Carpathia arrived, which might have given some of the people in the water a little bit more of a chance for survival. So yes, in theory, side-mounted coal bunkers might have prolonged Titanic's stay on the surface long enough for more people to be saved, but it's not going to stop it sinking overall. Matt Blom asks, how was it determined how long a warship's boilers could steam under forced draft, and were there any notable efforts or technologies developed to extend time spent utilising this speed boost? Well, theoretically, if you ran the boilers under forced draft for long enough, something would break and go boom. But, to be perfectly honest, as long as your boilers were relatively well built, the limitation on how long you could run under forced draft was usually down to manpower or fuel. Not that you'd run out of fuel, but working in a hot, high-pressure environment, literally because you're forcing air into an enclosed compartment, meant that your stokers, etc., engineers could only function for so long, and they would then have to be relieved, which puts a human limit on how long you can run under forced draft, because the time necessary to recover once you've been completely done in by operating in a forced draft boiler room is not long enough to just keep rotating the crew through. For the most part, you'd run out of crew able to sustain the effort before the boilers broke, assuming you've got good boilers. The other thing is, much more importantly, is fuel. So if you've got, let's say, German bituminous coal going, running under forced draft, you're consuming an awful lot of it. You're generating a lot of clinker and ash. Even with really good Welsh anthracite coal, that's still going to happen, just at a slower rate, but at a much faster rate than normal steaming. So again, not only are you going to run out of crew, you're also going to run out of clean boiler spaces, because they're going to get clogged up, which is going to force you to slow down as well. So those two things would, again, if your boiler was built well enough, usually stop you from running at forced draft long before the boilers themselves got to the point where they might go bang. With the caveat, that depends on exactly how much forced draft you're running at, because there are degrees of forced draft. If you're going absolutely pedal to the metal at every single last erg of power that you can get from the system, forced draft, then yes, you probably would blow the boilers before your crew or fuel caused you issues. But people kind of knew that, and also it's not something that you can precisely tell. There would be telltale giveaways that the engineers could tell the captain, this is going to go, we need to stop now, or at least we need to cool things down now. But it is a little bit, unfortunately, of a moving target. You couldn't sort of stick a stamp on it and say, right, this boiler will run for 8 hours at forced draft of this many extra pounds per square inch or whatever before it blows up, because that might be the average if you tested some boilers to destruction, but you could have a boiler that might blow up in half that time. You might have a boiler that might last twice as long, down to the vagaries of their construction and the circumstances at the time. But they were aware, obviously, that if you did run them for too long, they would eventually explode. Ryan Gale asks, why was HMAS Australia not more involved in the surface battles in the Guadalcanal campaign? From what I can tell, after Savo Island, she was only ever on carrier escort or patrol duty, and given the dire need that the Allied surface forces had for cruisers during the campaign, dire enough to pull the Atlantas from escort carrier duty, why wasn't Australia included in any of the task forces in Iron Bottom Sound? Was this simply a case of the Allies not wanting mixed Navy command structures involved anymore in surface action, since Crutchley might have had seniority in an otherwise entirely USN formation, or was there another reason? I think there are a number of reasons, some of which are definite, some of which are potentially hypothetical, but all of which probably add up, maybe a little bit of everything. Firstly, of course, Australia was the lead ship of Task Force 44, as it was dubbed by that point, and, well, there wasn't a tremendous amount left of it after the first Battle of Savo Island, but when it was reconstituted, as you mentioned, it was used in carrier escort missions. It was also used to protect convoys and a couple of bits of bombardment. The thing is, although overall US and Allied cruiser numbers had dropped quite significantly during the Guadalcanal campaign, there were still various cruisers in various areas, and they were still needed for different operations. So Australia, as a relatively powerful heavy cruiser, was still useful in other roles, and by the fact that it was off doing something, leading a force, it meant that a US Navy cruiser didn't have to do that, and of course a US Navy cruiser in theory would have greater interoperability with other US Navy cruisers as opposed to a Royal Australian Navy cruiser operating with the US Navy, no matter how close they'd cooperated in the past. Then you've also got the fact that Australia had been subject to bombing by the US Army Air Force, and then the US Army Air Force refused to acknowledge they'd actually done it, even though everyone knew they had, in a case of mistaken identity, because of course the US Navy didn't have any ships that resembled the County class. So there may have been a concern that, especially in the close night actions that were developing around Guadalcanal, the relatively unfamiliar profile of the Australia might invite an unfortunate friendly fire incident, which would obviously not be good. Plus, there was the fact that with the loss of the Canberra, Australia was the Australian Navy's only remaining heavy cruiser, so there may have been, again, can't prove it, but there may have been some kind of drive behind the scenes to try and keep Australia to areas where she wasn't incredibly likely to be blown into small pieces, and given the casualty rates of American cruisers, the nights off Guadalcanal were probably not one of those places that you really wanted to be in those circumstances. But again, that's speculation. It's understandable speculation, but it might have been an issue. And the other factor is, as you mentioned, the fact that Admiral Crutchley was a relatively senior officer, and of course as the war went on would only gain seniority, which may have led to some slight feelings of, when he's operating with a carrier formation, then the admiral in charge of the carrier formation has overall command and he's one of the deputy commanders, whereas if you send the Australia off leading a bunch of cruisers into Iron Bottom Sound, it's going to be very difficult to find anyone more senior than Crutchley, so therefore Crutchley and the Royal Navy-Royal Australian Navy would be in charge of the operation, which may again have rubbed the US Navy up the wrong way just a bit. I mean, at one point Crutchley, while he was on carrier escort duty, was technically also, as the commander of the screen, in charge of the USS North Carolina, albeit obviously commanding from the Australia. So, fun times being had by all. Jake Hart asks, given the notorious inaccuracy of World War II level bombing, e.g. when bombing the port of Brest, how did the RAF score multiple direct hits on Tirpitz with tall boys despite deploying relatively few bombers and bombs? A couple of ways. Firstly, the Lancasters that dropped the tall boy used a fairly advanced bomb sight, which obviously increased the level of accuracy of the drop in the first place. Secondly, as you can probably tell, the tall boys were far more finely manufactured and far better manufactured aerodynamically than the vast majority of bombs dropped in World War II, and many corrections were made to the design to ensure this. You can see the tail fins there are slightly canted to enable it to rotate, i.e. spin, on its longitudinal axis, which has the same effect as rifling a gun when you fire the shell from that. So it's an incredibly stable and incredibly accurate weapon for the time. And certainly when you look at conventional shaped bombs being dropped in World War II, you can see all sorts of wonderful wibbly-wobbliness going on in the time that they transition from horizontal to roughly vertical as they head on down, all of which is affecting their accuracy. And let's not even go for the cookies, the blockbusters as they were called, which are essentially, here is a large metal cylinder. We have filled it with explosives. There is no concession to aerodynamics. Enjoy, before it's chucked out of the side of an aircraft, or out of the bottom if you're dropping out of a bomb bay. The tall boy is, comparatively speaking, a very finely crafted artisanal weapon. I mean, the casing is made out of a single piece of steel. The explosive filler is cast in a single movement. It's very, very finely balanced as well as being aerodynamic. And so it really represents, in some ways, not completely, but in some ways it's kind of a step towards the smart bombs of today. It's a much higher precision weapon, which it has to be considering it's so large and so heavy you can't carry that many of them. And there is always a rather amusing story that comes from my great uncle, in fact from his RAF days, which talks about the fact that at least according to the way the story goes, when the RAF was first testing the Tall Boy bomb, they wanted to see what it looked like coming down, so they set up a big target set of roundels, kind of looking like a giant archery target from the sky, and they set up a camera to record the bomb coming in, and they thought, well, what is the single safest place to put the camera on this first test run of this new experimental weapon? Well, wherever it's going to hit, it's not going to hit dead centre on the target, so let's put the camera in the ground there and see what happens. Lancaster duly came over, aimed for the centre, dropped the bomb, and the last thing the camera ever saw was a 12,000-pound tall boy coming straight for its face, which I believe took everybody by surprise, not least of all, of course, the camera. So yeah, that's how you manage to get multiple hits on a battleship despite dropping relatively few bombs. Sapper Ninja asks, after watching the channel for some time, I'm somewhat familiar with your thoughts on the Bismarck class with its, and I'm sorry to say this to a fellow engineer, inefficiencies, as well as the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs. But what about the other major surface combatants of the Kriegsmarine? Could I trouble you for some brief thoughts and on the design and intended doctrine for the Deutschlands, Scharnhorsts and Hippers? Well, each of the ships classes you mentioned did have some rather interesting flaws. The German ships generally seem to have a habit of their sterns collapsing when they get hit, so that is a potential design weakness, albeit obviously American cruisers have a habit of losing their bows, so it's not exactly a German-only trait. It's just, and it could also just be luck of the draw. The Germans, if they keep getting torpedoed in the sterns, well, the sterns are more likely to collapse than if they get hit in the bows, which usually doesn't cause the stern to collapse, but never mind. That aside, the Hippers are probably, of the three that you mention, the ones I like the least. Yes, they look like miniature Bismarcks, but they also tend to come with most of the inefficiencies of a miniature Bismarck. The Hippers, like the Bismarcks, they can kind of take on their treaty-era equivalents in a roughly fair fight, but considering that they outmass their treaty-era equivalents by a factor of 60%, that's not exactly saying all that much. I mean, it's even worse than the Bismarcks. I mean, at least the Bismarcks have the good grace to say less than 50% more displacement than the treaty battleships. I mean, can you imagine for the same kind of level of silliness that we're imagining here, we'd be talking about what? I mean, half of a treaty-era battleship's displacement is 17,500 tons. So you'd be talking about a ship, well, 17,500 plus the 35,000 ton limit already existing is already taking you to 52,000 tons and a bit. So for 60%, you're basically talking about somewhere in the mid 50,000 ton standard displacement, to give you some idea of just how outlandishly oversized the Hippers were compared to treaty-era cruisers, if you were going to do the same kind of outlandish outsizing with treaty-era battleships. So yeah, not even an Iowa outmasses a treaty-era battleship by the same degree proportionally as a Hipper outmasses a treaty-era cruiser. And what do you get for that? Well, you get 32 knots, you get 8 8-inch guns, you get, okay, fair enough, a somewhat impressive-looking secondary battery to a degree, a reasonable but not spectacular amount of armour. You know, it can fight a county class or something like that, or a New Orleans, okay, and obviously, you know, Hipper versus Berwick got the better of that particular exchange, but they don't have a huge advantage over their treaty-era counterparts, which is pretty damning. And then you compare them to a Baltimore class, which was obviously the US post-treaty heavy cruiser. Well, what does the Baltimore class give you? Well, it's 13,600 tons for a start. So the Baltimore class has a weight difference where you could basically build an entire Fletcher class destroyer and stack it on top of the Baltimore, and you're still not going to be quite at the same displacement as a Hipper. And the Baltimore brings you an extra 8-inch gun. It brings you the same number of secondary AA guns, except that the 5-inch 38 is a far superior weapon and laid out far better than the 105mm or 4.1-inch guns that the Germans are carrying. It's got a massively, massively more extensive anti-aircraft battery for light and medium AA. Granted, the Baltimore doesn't carry torpedoes, the Hippers do, but the Baltimore also actually carries armour that might protect it at decent battle ranges against incoming 8-inch gunfire, which is a little bit important. And they're not faster. All for considerably less displacement. So yeah, Hippers, not really my cup of tea in any way, shape or form. I'd say they're decent enough, they'll give you a straight up fight, but for what they cost in terms of displacement, they're not. They are hideously inefficient. The Deutschlands are an odd one. They are good at the time that they are built, as long as you just close your eyes and pretend that the British battle cruisers don't exist in terms of commerce rating, which I suppose, to be fair, given that they were initially designed primarily against the Marine Nationale, they're probably a fair assessment at that point, because the Marine Nationale didn't have any fast capital ships. So the Deutschlands do have their own set of issues in that obviously they are designed to take on and beat any treaty-era cruiser. Yes, sure, they can do that, but as Graf Spee showed, treaty-era cruisers tend to turn up in more than one when they have to deal with something like the Graf Spee. So it's what I call a case of primary doctrinal success, secondary doctrinal failure, i.e. someone's looked at a current situation and gone, we will build a ship that will do really well in this particular circumstance, but they haven't really thought one step beyond that to what happens, like what is the enemy's response going to be outside of your carefully constructed artificial environment. But there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the Deutschlands in and of themselves. They're not hideously inefficient the way the Hippers are. There's just some flaws in the ideas that underpin them. And then you get to the Scharnhorsts, whose main failings are being built with 11-inch guns, and which they can't really control, and the fact that they tend to be, well, not the world's best sea boats. Even with Atlantic Bow 2.0, they still took water over the bow quite a bit, which is not ideal. But then considering that some other ships that are otherwise particularly good ships also have that problem, you can't hold against them too much. And, as I've said before, Scharnhorsts, but armed with twin 15-inch instead, would have been very creditable small, fast battleships. So, of all of the ones that you've named, the Scharnhorsts, I would say, probably represent the top end of German non-destroyer design, and let's not even get into the destroyers. Again, they have their issues, but they also have the most potential to be effective, and they're not, especially if they were built in a 15-inch form, they're not actually that inefficient, if at all. The Deutschlands, as I say, decent enough ships for what they are, just a little bit of a second-tier doctrinal failure, from my opinion, and the Hippers are just a bloated mess. Andrew Waite asks, you calculated that the 15-inch guns outside the IWM would hit Enfield if fired. What would the 14-inch Mark 7 gun at Fort Nelson hit if it were to be fired? Would it trouble the residents of the Isle of Wight? Now, is this going to be some kind of thing where people are finding more and more obscure naval guns mounted in places to work out where they would hit and asking me to calculate it? Because if so, I'm completely down for it. It really engages the engineer part of me. Now, with the Fort Nelson guns, or gun, I should say, it's a little bit more difficult to calculate because they've had the temerity to mount the thing on a slope. But taking the best side profile picture I could find and then adjusting the horizon to a level, it would seem that the gun is elevated at around about just over 5.5 degrees, between 5 and 6 degrees. If I ever get down to Fort Nelson, I'll have to check that myself. But luckily, at a 5.5 degree elevation, we do know the range, which is 10,000 yards or 9,140 meters. And if you measure the distance 9,140 metres from the gun at Fort Nelson, you actually end up not worrying the people of the Isle of Wight. Actually, the good people of the Gosport Lifeboat Station and the Gosport District and Angling Club would be very, very startled by a large explosion just a couple of 100 metres or so just southeast of their position. So it wouldn't hit them directly, but it would land maybe 100-150 metres southeast of them on what looks to be a bunch of fields, possibly actually looking at the satellite, that may even be a golf course, in which case, well, new bunker. Depending on the varieties of wind and waves, etc., it might also just about overshoot the golf course and splash down on the beach, right on the coast of the Solent. So flying right over Gosport, and ironically enough, not quite heading straight over, but passing very near the Explosion Museum of Naval Firepower. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, when a ship like Warspite's main guns were replaced after being worn out from firing, what needed to be done, and how long would a prepared shipyard take to replace them? Does the turret need to be disassembled, particularly if the gun does not use a liner? Well, it's not quite Warspite, but here's Ramillies, which basically has the same turret. So, not entirely the same turret, obviously, because Warspite was modified for longer-range fire, but for the purposes of changing the barrels, it has the same turret. So, anyway, here is Ramillies having her guns changed. And as you can see, they have taken off the turret roof. Big crane has come in. It's lifted out one of, well, in this case, both barrels from the superfiring turret. One of them is currently in the process of being lifted. And they take it away. And then the crane picks up a newly lined barrel and drops it back in again. So this is effectively how you do it. So the turret needs to be partially disassembled in terms of taking the roof off. But even with a liner, you still have to take the gun out because, well, removing a battleship gun's liner whilst the gun is in place in the turret and then installing a new one, not really a job that I think anyone's ever going to want to try, if indeed it's even possible, which I doubt. So it's not kind of plug and play option, but what it does mean with a liner is that you don't have to build an entirely new gun barrel, but you do still take the gun barrel off to the factory to switch the liner out. But in terms of how long a prepared shipyard would take to replace them, it very much depends on what labour resources are available and how many guns you're replacing, because in theory, getting the roof of the turret off, dismounting the guns, and putting new ones in, then putting the turret roof back on could be done in under a week if you had prepared crews ready and obviously the new guns ready on the quayside. But if you're replacing all the guns on the ship, so you're having to, in the case of something like Warspite or Ramillies, take off 4 turret roofs, take off 8 guns and have 8 guns ready, that's going to extend things somewhat. Although, again, if you've got a lot of crew there, you might still be able to pull it off in less than a week, but you'd be using an awful lot of resources to do so. The Rogue Chief asked, in a previous Drydock, you discussed the reasons why battleships used wing turrets in the ironclad and pre-dreadnought eras, but why were they still in use post-dreadnought when turbines and Harvey and Krupp steel made many of these reasons superfluous, especially as the South Carolinas proved the efficient capabilities of superfiring turrets? There were a variety of reasons depending on the Navy and depending on the class of ship. So for the Bellerophon and St. Vincent classes, they were slightly modified versions of the Dreadnought design, and as I mentioned in the previous question, Dreadnought was designed with wing turrets, mainly because Jackie Fisher wanted to be able to bring a 6-gun broadside forward. The Dreadnought design actually had more than enough space to allow for a South Carolina-style superfiring layout, or indeed just having superfiring forward and the spaced turrets aft, which would have given the same broadside with considerable weight savings. But since they were just effectively repeating the design with minor modifications, that's why those two had it. You had the Helgolands, which had the same hexagonal layout as the Nassaus. That was repeated more because, although they'd seen by the point they were building them, that several nations were building superfiring positions. There were some within the Kaiserliche Marine who felt that superfiring turrets presented a vulnerability in that being so close together, perhaps a single shot could disable both. They won the argument for the Helgolands and then lost the argument when it came to building the Kaisers. So the Kaisers are an intermediate step in that they don't have the hexagonal layout, but they still do have the wing layout, except it's not like Dreadnought or Bellerophon or St. Vincent, where they're equal. They are en echelon to provide a degree of cross-deck firing, which is the same as you see on ships like Colossus and Hercules. And to be fair, the Minas Gerais, the Riverdavias, a lot of ships from around about that period. And of course you also see en echelon on some of the earliest British battle cruisers. Now, with some ships like the battle cruisers, the en echelon was partly because even with turbines, if you wanted to get up to very high speeds, like for battle cruisers, you still had a fair bit of space amidships occupied by machinery, so the en echelon arrangement was a way to get more guns theoretically on a broadside while still giving yourself enough machinery space. On the battleships, it was partly concerns about redundancy, partly a desire to bring about a heavier broadside, because it was felt that obviously an echelon theoretically allows you to bring both your wing turrets to bear in a broadside, which gives you a greater weight of fire than if you have a single amidships turret, again, in theory. So, for example, with the Kaisers, if you were very, very lucky, if all the stars aligned, you could get a 10-gun broadside without having to extend your armoured citadel too much, because obviously these two wing turrets were abreast of the machinery. You were having to protect that machinery space anyway, whereas if you had a superfiring turret forward, then that would extend the length of your magazines as in side profile as well as your machinery, so you'd have to have more armour covering the sides of the ship, which would then either mean an increase in weight or a thinning of the armour, depending on whether you were maintaining displacement or increasing costs. But as it turned out, with those various ships, it was an inefficient layout. There were all the weaknesses discussed in the previous question, and of course the fact that the en echelon arrangements usually didn't work very well at all. The best they worked was marginally acceptably on some vessels. And so, for example, when you look at the difference between the Kaiser class and the König class, with the Königs, they basically take the same number of turrets, so you have 5 twin turrets, but by rearranging those, taking one of the en echelon turrets and putting it in a super-firing position forward, and then moving the other one amidships in roughly the position the en echelons had been, you still had a 10-gun broadside, but you had a 10-gun broadside that was reliable over much greater arcs than with the previous layout. So most of the conflicts over en echelon or wing turrets versus superfiring was effectively some older ideas about how to construct ships and what was the most efficient way of setting out your guns for the best firing layout, which were then in most cases disproven or discredited by actual operational experience, thus ending up with what you actually have by the 1910s developing, which is the all-centerline arrangement. Andre Gardner asks, in Bilge Pumps 85 it was said, they're not Marines, they're naval infantry. Could you expound on the difference between the two within the scope of the channel? Now, this can be seen as splitting hairs somewhat, because in a number of countries, while they might officially be referred to as naval infantry, other people will call them that country's Marines and vice versa. But when you do split hairs, the difference from a historical perspective at least appears to be that Marines, as such, tend to have their origins as shipboard soldiers, basically naval specialised troops aboard ships for the purposes of ship security, boarding and capturing the enemy, and then conducting amphibious assaults, whilst definitely part of their specialism is kind of secondary. So they're more sea-based with the option to go on land, rather than the other way around. And as a result, again, at least initially, most of their organisation in terms of practical day-to-day organisation, as compared to on paper, is in small detachments aboard ships. Whereas naval infantry in various countries seems to have, although they might initially have those same kind of origins, they more rapidly evolve into something that more closely resembles a land-based armies organisation. So they have obviously as well have the capability of doing amphibious operations, but the bulk of their activities is usually fighting on land, whether that be landed from ships in support of naval operations or whatever. But they spend, as I say, most of their time and most of their effort is spent looking at supporting land-based duties, but with a marine flavour. They can still do the roles of Marines in terms of shipboard security and so forth, but they tend to be organised more like a regular infantry battalion rather than the elite specialists that most Marine units tend to be organised as. Now, the US Marine Corps is a bit of a unique case in that they, over time, have grown large enough and powerful enough that by that definition, they actually verge more towards naval infantry with armour and their own air force than anything else. Much in the way that the Russian naval infantry, as you can see here in World War II, acted. The Russian naval infantry, for a good chunk of World War II, was basically a slightly water-flavoured version of the other Russian infantry units on land. Whereas units like the Royal Marines, the Dutch Royal Marines, and various other European Royal Marines and other marine units in other European and other nations' countries tend to be focused on the smaller, what we today would call kind of elite special forces roles. So obviously in World War II you have the Royal Marine Commandos being formed as well. So in some ways it's a matter of scale, but mostly it's a matter of organisational emphasis more than anything else. Although, again, it is splitting hairs, and I'm sure other people might disagree. John McCarthy asks, what makes a Chinese junk a junk? How does it differ from contemporary Western ships in construction and sailing qualities, and why does it have that highly curved keel? How did it get its name? Unfortunately, whilst the idea of what makes a typical Chinese junk is probably fairly well embedded in everybody's minds, something like what you see on the screen in front of you, technically speaking, it's almost a no true Scotsman question, because most definitions of a junk include what they call the battened sails, the things you can see here, not quite square, but made up of multiple segments with stiffening ribs in them. And a lot of sources also talk about, as you said, this kind of curved, relatively flat-bottomed hull. And put the two together, plus some interior division, and you get the classic Chinese junk. Unfortunately, there are ships that have the classic hull, but have more, well, what we in the West would call regular single-piece cloth sails. And they're also junks. And you have ships that have a hull that's nothing like this traditional curve one, but do have the batten sails. They are also junks. Fundamentally, the problem is that junk is a derived term in English, obviously slightly unfortunate connotations, but the original term that it comes from is literally just a term that effectively translates to a vessel from the Far East. So that's helpful. But if you mean the particular vessel like the one we see in front of us, how does it differ from construction? Well, it had internal bulkhead divisions long before Western vessels did. Although obviously it is, as I said, built usually with a much shallower draft, much flatter bottom, not so much of a keel, although again this can differ. Sailing qualities, well, because of this it's fairly stable, but is less able to hold its direction in high seas and high winds than a deep keeled vessel can. So this is why you tend to see them, at least at the scale they're most commonly seen, in coastal waters and doing short trips across the ocean. Of course, you have the whole treasure ships of Zhenghe and so forth, which would have been a lot bigger and therefore have considerably more sailing qualities. As to why it has this highly curved form, it's basically, as far as I can tell, at least a case of following what the local materials are capable of doing. And you actually see this quite a lot in general ship construction before, and we're talking about in the West, before maybe the 17th century. So you look at a 15th or 16th century galleon or warship, and they also have a very curved hull. The only real difference, if you look at a medieval cog or an Elizabethan galleon or so forth, even something like Vasa, they've got this same kind of curve to their hull, maybe not quite as pronounced, and also obviously European ships tend to come to a rounded bow, which then usually has a slightly more pointed infrastructure attached to the front, whereas the Chinese junks, for the most part, tend to come to a much flatter bow, which gives them a much more distinctive appearance. Someone whose name is... I can't even read that. I must be tired. It's just a mess of letters to me. Sorry. Anyway, you'll recognise your question. They ask, what was the Ukrainian Navy like in early 1919? The answer is that without a huge amount of in-depth research in countries which currently are probably not exactly safe to go to, it's probably incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to say. For a variety of reasons, including the fact, obviously, the current situation means that an awful lot of people have written an awful lot of things, not just because of the current situation, the situation that's going on for the past 10 years or so, a lot of which are mutually contradictory, and an awful lot of which are also verifiably false. What can be said is that there was a Ukrainian Navy in 1919. Exactly how many ships it consisted of is the thing that's completely open for discussion, because ostensibly they had the bulk of the Russian Black Sea fleet at one point, which is believable since they controlled Sevastopol, which was its main base. On the other hand, quite a number of sources will claim things like the cruiser Krasny Krim, somehow. Despite the fact that Krasny Krim was built in the Baltic, and also throughout sort of 1917 through 1919 through 1920-21, she was still on the stocks. Likewise, the dreadnought Imperatricia Ekaterina Velikaya, which is one of the Imperatricia Maria class battleships, derivatives of the Ganguts, is sometimes also claimed as having been part of the Ukrainian Navy. But, well, she was scuttled and had a magazine explosion as a result of that in 1918, so whatever someone says, she definitely wasn't part of the Ukrainian Navy in 1919, and so on and so on and so forth. And yeah, you can imagine the amount of, no, this was ours, no, this wasn't ours, no, that was never yours, that goes on at the moment. And until recently, no one's been particularly interested in writing a history of the Ukrainian Navy, so there's not a tremendous amount of sources that from before the last 10 years that talk about it either, in book form. And, well, then you have to also get into the White Russians versus Red Russians, ongoing Russian Revolution, etc., and, which parts of the former Russian Empire were which, and who were they aligned with, and were they independent and cooperating, or were they all part of one? And, that whole conflict, people still argue about the history. So the short answer is, it existed, it had some ships, exactly how many, I don't know, and I doubt anyone else is being honest about it either at the moment. Glenn Ricafrente asks, In your guide to HMS Hotspur, you mentioned she served for a while in a unit called the Particular Service Squadron. I love that name. I find it so very British. Could you tell us about this squadron, particularly the origin of its unusual name? So the Particular Service Squadron was a formation that came and went in Royal Navy service. At one point, it was actually the designation for the Channel Squadron, which would later become the Channel Fleet. But both before and after that period, the Particular Service Squadron was something that was formed for specific reasons and was then made up of various ships drawn from across the Royal Navy for whatever particular service they had decided they needed to go with at that point. So, for example, during the Crimean War and then subsequently with various tensions that blew up in that area, a number of particular service squadrons were formed and then disbanded later on, which were made up of shallow draft vessels. It could also be used as a testing ground. So if the Royal Navy wanted to put together a bunch of ships and go, okay, well, we've got these ones and we've got these ones, they have different performance characteristics, maybe a different engine or whatever, and we want to test and compare how they do, well, time to form the Particular Service Squadron. It was basically a single formation you could put under the command of a single individual when the Royal Navy needed some specific task to be done that wasn't in the usual realm of form battle fleet, go and blow something up, and then they would assign the necessary ships to it. They would carry out the task that was needed of them, and then usually they'd come back and be disbanded. It could also be held, if they wanted to hold the formation for a while, as a kind of threat. So obviously you had the Mediterranean fleet, for example, or the home fleet at various points, and those fleets had known approximate geographical areas of responsibility, whereas if you had the Particular Service Squadron, you could make a very specific point without making it too directly. So again, drawing on the coast attack example, let's say that somebody was kicking off in the Baltic or the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, and they didn't have the world's largest fleet, but they did have a lot of rather nice coastal bases that were heavily fortified. Now, you don't necessarily want to move your entire local fleet into that area because that might, actually start a war rather than deterring it, and it's going to be expensive. It would also divert them from doing their job day to day in that area. But you do want to send a message that, we see what you're doing, we don't like what you're doing, and we do happen to have the assets on hand to deal with you. But, they're not anywhere nearby, so you can't really accuse us of anything. We're just, letting you know. Effectively a giant diplomatic and naval version of not touching you. And so, in that circumstance, you might get a bunch of coastal defence ships with shallow draft, like Hotspur, and heavy artillery, put them all together into a Particular Service Squadron, and then you could keep them around near the UK. So, short operational ranges, doesn't cost too much to run, and of course, well, they're operating off of the UK coastline, so of course they're not a threat to you, Mr. Whoever you are in whichever sea you happen to be in. No, the fact that we happen to have formed a Particular Service Squadron that seems entirely geared around coastal assault operations is completely coincidental, and also, don't do what we don't want you to do. Mason asks, was Bismarck capable of taking on multiple US standards or British Dreadnought-era battleships with a likely chance of winning, or is the agedness of older ships' fire control systems overstated? Well, it depends which standards or British World War I ships you want to look at, because the main advantage that Bismarck has over them is speed. It can dictate whether or not it fights the battle, it can dictate what range it fights the battle at, assuming that it's open ocean. And it can choose to just leave if it wants to. Now, that ties into the second advantage it has, in that because it has fairly modern guns, those guns can reach out a fairly long way, and so it can, combined with the speed, it can reach out and attack enemy ships at considerable range. Protection-wise, meh. But when it comes to taking on multiple US standards or British dreadnoughts, they're not all created equal. So if you were to say look at, I don't know, West Virginia and California in 1945, when they've had their extensive refits, taking on those two, Bismarck one-on-one, no, that's not going to happen unless Bismarck somehow manages to find a way to isolate one at the expense of the other. And this is kind of the problem. Yes, Bismarck can outrange them with its guns in absolute terms, but as long as the two ships stick together, it is going to have difficulty in forcing an engagement on a one-on-one and then moving on to the other one. And as we've discussed many times before, there is a practical limit to when you're realistically going to hit something, and all the ships involved could hit in those circumstances. We're talking about refit California, refit West Virginia. They can all hit within that practical range. So the fact that Bismarck, in theory, could sit at the high 30s of thousands of yards and bombard away, and maybe some of the standards and some of the British pre-dreads couldn't respond. World War I dreadnoughts couldn't respond at that kind of range. Yes, that is technically true. However, the chances of Bismarck actually hitting anybody at that point are slim to none, which is pretty much the same for everybody. So, it's not exactly a winning strategy. If they're closing to range where they're actually going to hit each other, then, the fact that maybe Bismarck might be firing on West Virginia from 25,000 yards, and California's having to engage at 27,000 yards or something like that, near enough as makes no difference. It's a 2v1, and in a 2v1 situation, Bismarck's not going to come out of it very well unless it manages a spectacular hood-like early destruction of the first ship, which is relatively unlikely. And the same thing with the British. If you take Bismarck up against Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, or Warspite and Hood, assuming you don't get the Golden BB, or something like that, then no, it's in most normal courses of events, the updated fire control systems that the older ships have got will mean that they can range in on Bismarck and, in good time, start to land hits, and at least one ship is probably going to be unengaged. It's the whole 2v1 conundrum, and obviously you add more ships in, then it becomes even worse, and then Bismarck will be first crippled and then later destroyed. The flip side is that there are other US standards and other British Dreadnought-era battleships where Bismarck maybe could take them on 2v1 with a chance of winning. So you've got, Arkansas and New York, for example, not had the world's latest and greatest rangefinder updates, don't have the world's latest and greatest range, relatively slow, obviously being the oldest ships in the US fleet, having battleship fleet having the least protection. So could Bismarck take on both of those and win? Quite possibly. And the same thing with taking on maybe a couple of the R-class or Barham and Malaya. Their systems aren't as up to date as the more updated vessels. They, especially by the mid-war period, are also having speed issues, and in some cases with those ships from both navies, their range might not actually be all that great either in terms of their gun range. So the Bismarck might have a sweet spot where it can stand and hit, and maybe not be hit in return, or not be likely to be hit in return. So it really depends on which vessels you're looking at. The absolute oldest in the US or British fleets, then sure, maybe Bismarck in a knockdown drag-out fight could beat two of them in a 2v1. But the latest and greatest from those lines, the ones with the most recent refits, I'm not going to put my money on the German. Xerxes asks, in German, pre-dreadnoughts are called standard ships of the line because of using a twin forward, twin aft main battery arrangement as standard. However, there were some ships or classes that swayed from that layout. What were the reasons for that, and which layout do you consider to be the best or worst for their expected use? Well, there are a variety of, as you say, non-standard pre-dreadnoughts. And to be honest, none of them really, in my mind, compete for a category of best, because the whole point of the pre-dreadnought layout, i.e. 4 guns usually laid out in a 2-gun forward, 2-gun aft configuration with the same caliber, was, that's a decent minimum salvo of the same caliber weapons, 4-gun broadside, reasonable-ish chance of hitting, at least if you're at the correct range. Now, the Germans deviated themselves with the Brandenburg class, which you can see in the picture. Now, they had twin forward, twin aft, but they also, you might be able to just about see, had a twin amidship. So they had 6 guns, and they were all 11 inches. So I might think, is this an early version of a dreadnought? No, because those 11-inch guns amidships were shorter barreled, fewer caliber than the 11-inch fore and aft, which made them possibly the worst choice imaginable, because now you couldn't even distinguish the difference of the shell splashes by their size, because those shells in the middle were going to explode with exactly the same force as the shells launched from the fore and aft guns, except obviously being a shorter caliber weapon, those shells are going to be travelling on completely different ballistic courses, so you end up with 6 shell splashes and very little idea of which ones came from which guns, which is going to make correcting for your fire control incredibly awkward. Then you have a bunch of the earlier French pre-dreadnoughts, which tended to have a single 12-inch gun fore and aft, and then a pair of slightly smaller guns on the wings, usually something in the region of 10 inches, give or take a few fractions of an inch. They weren't exactly 10, but anyway. And I mean, they have obviously less broadside weight than a conventional pre-dreadnought, because they've only got 2 main guns and then a smaller secondary one. So 3 guns only, and instead of 4, one of them is lighter. At least the shells are a different size, so you might have a slightly better luck discerning the ballistics. But it probably wouldn't matter too much, because at any kind of significant range, obviously, a 2-gun salvo from similar guns is not enough to make a range estimate. About the only thing that those wing mountings do give is that theoretically you have a 3-gun salvo in any given direction, because you can fire those wing mounts fore and aft. But that just flips the problem around, because now you have 2 smaller guns and 1 larger one. So, yeah, not good. And, so on and so forth. So I don't think I can really find any non-conventional pre-dreadnought layout that I can praise, because, well, to be honest, if it had worked better than the conventional pre-dreadnought layout, it would have become the conventional pre-dreadnought layout. This is, of course, assuming you go with the relatively standard definition of what constitutes a pre-dreadnought battleship, which is effectively defined by the Majestic class. So the argument is that all steel armour, twin turret forward, twin turret aft, high freeboard, that is the basic requirements for being a pre-dreadnought. Although, the twin turret forward, twin turret aft thing is negotiable, but it's usually if you get rid of that, it's enclosed gun houses, i.e. fully armoured barbettes, steel armour, high freeboard, and that becomes your pre-dreadnought. So the Royal Sovereigns, although they contain many of the features of the Majestics, tend, well, just about by a slim majority to be classified as not pre-dreadnoughts, because they have open barbettes. And then, of course, you have HMS Hood from that era, which is part of it, which has, a very, very low freeboard, but that's a separate matter entirely. Once you get further back than that, you start to enter things like compound armour and so forth, which is a bit messy. Duke Master asks, I understand most turret arrangements on ships and the reasons for choosing them, but the G3-N3 design foils me. It's not conventional front and rear layout, but it's also not an all-forward layout. 2 forward and 1 semi-amidships with a limited superstructure between the 2 seems to forego the advantages of all of the above. What does this design provide? It provides similar weight savings to an all-forward arrangement, but there are some trade-offs. So obviously the aftmost turret has a much more limited arc of fire. On the flip side, the bridge is able to be positioned further forward, which theoretically means better ship handling. Now, that was a concern when they built the Nelsons, and initially there were some issues. As it turns out, whilst having a bridge quite far aft, like the Nelsons did, is not ideal, you can actually learn to handle a ship fairly well from that position. So it wasn't as much of an issue as they thought it was going to be, but of course the G3N3 designs precede that, and of course the G3 is now going to be represented in Game and World of Warships by the Tier 9 Duncan, hence the picture here. So that's why that's there. Anyway, the main weight savings it provides is in two main areas. Firstly, you'll find on a fair number of battleship designs, not all, but a fair number of them, that the armour over the machinery space is thinner than the armour over the ship's magazines, and that is the case with the G3 design. It's 14 inches over the magazines, 12 inches over the machinery. Now, in a fore and aft layout, that means obviously you've got to protect the magazines directly and again next to them, but you've also got to protect an area forward of the forward magazines and then aft of the forward magazines with the same thickness of armour, because obviously shells might be coming in from not a 90-degree angle. And then you've got to do the same thing fore and aft of the aft magazines. So you've got quite a bit of armour that is extending past the magazines at maximum thickness. Now, with the clustered design on the G3, and then obviously also the all-forward design, you don't have to do that. You just have the magazines being protected and then one extension forward and one extension aft. So that's a couple of dozen feet worth of maximum thickness armour that you've saved. And the same thing with deck armour. Now, obviously, ideally, you'd want an all-forward arrangement because that obviously gives you better arcs of fire, and you don't have to also protect the superstructure area, which you do in this particular layout. So, it's not as good as the Nelsons, but say the Nelsons were an evolved form. Another area of weight saving comes from the way the hull is shaped, because of course the hull is widest amidships. So if you've got your guns forward, you're going to have those. By putting the next turret amidships, you're making use of an area that's obviously has the greatest beam, so has the greatest potential for protection, and also doesn't require you to make any alterations or sacrifices to the hull in order to accommodate the turret and the magazine below it. Whereas as you travel further aft, the machinery is individually relatively large, boilers and turbines and such, but can be rearranged and can be aligned in such a way to take up less width. Now, normally when the machinery is placed roughly amidships, this doesn't really matter. People sometimes use the opportunity to have the machinery spaces quite wide. Sometimes they put in lots of anti-torpedo defences or whatever. But the machinery spaces don't need that width of hull, whereas for proper protection and for accommodation of just the sheer size of the thing, the barbette and the magazines do. So if you have this arrangement, or indeed an all-forward arrangement where the machinery spaces are all placed aft, it means you can actually start narrowing the hull much earlier than you would on a more conventional ship, where you have to keep the hull width up to a certain beam until you get past the aft turret. And of course, if your hull begins to narrow and has therefore a more hydrodynamically pleasing profile sooner as you head aft, that means A, you're going to go faster for less power, which means your machinery space can be further reduced, which has a certain degree of cyclical benefit, but also it means that past a certain point your hull physically occupies less volume. Therefore, it displaces less, so costs less, but if it also occupies less volume, whilst that's not necessarily going to reduce the area of belt armour protection, it is going to start drastically cutting in by hundreds of square feet on the amount of deck armour you need. And as we've discussed before, deck armour, even though it's much thinner than belt armour, often weighs as much or more in many cases than the belt armour because it covers so much of a greater surface area. So you make big weight savings there as well. So, in summary, the citadel becomes shorter, the amount of armour you need in terms of surface area goes down, your machinery requirements go down because your hull is a better hydrodynamic form, and your displacement goes down for the same reasons, which means that your overall cost of the ship goes down. Is the G3N3 layout absolutely ideal to achieve all of these benefits? No. An all-forward arrangement would be better, but it's a useful stepping stone that contains most of the benefits, but not all. Nick Brodar asks, why is bronze preferred for propeller blades? A few different reasons. It can be cast, so it can be made into all sorts of funky shapes as long as you've got proper moulds, and it's repeatable, which is very important, obviously, because you can use the same mould to cast multiple blades or entire propellers if you're casting smaller ones. Additionally, it's not a ferrous metal, so it won't rust, which is absolutely fantastic, because some of the early propellers that were made of iron, and they had to be heavily painted in order for them to just not turn into a lump of useless rust immediately. And even then, it was an absolute pig to keep them all, repainted constantly, because whirling propeller, the paint will wear off a lot quicker than almost anything else. Whereas bronze has this happy characteristic of it'll just, merrily sit in the sea for a very, very long time, because it's an alloy with copper. It's also mildly toxic to a lot of stuff, so you won't get marine life growing on it very much. It can happen, but not an awful lot of the time. And also, little known characteristic of bronze, it work hardens. So actually, the more force and stress you put it through, the harder it becomes. So initially, it's obviously going to be a little bit soft unless you pre-work harden it. That can have a slight downside in that a very old propeller, if it hits something, is very likely to shatter or shear rather than bend. But it means that your propeller doesn't get weaker over time. It actually, it gets harder but slightly more brittle, which is like, it can have problems at the very end of the life, but it's not going to degrade and become, floppy and useless after a few years in the water. So, and there's a bunch of other attractions to it, but it's mainly the fact it doesn't rust and it keeps itself clean. Makes it an excellent material for propellers. Fishing for freshly fished fresh fish for Fish Fry Friday, featuring flowered founder fare. Oh my goodness. One day I'm going to find you. Anyway, they ask, can you explain the reasoning behind Operation Posthorn? So Operation Posthorn was actually technically the combat debut of Richelieu after she had been in refit in the States. The objective was to try and secure the safe passage of a convoy to Russia, one of the Arctic convoys, because, of course, the Allies had tried various methods. They'd tried, obviously, regular convoys. You'd had PQ-17. They'd tried heavy escort groups. You'd had the Battle of the Barents Sea. You'd had Battle of the North Cape. Admittedly, both of those had gone relatively well for the Allies, but given the time period that Posthorn took place in towards the end of the war, they were looking to maybe take a little bit more of a proactive role in making sure that the Germans didn't have any chance, because of course Barents Sea and North Cape could, had circumstances been fractionally different, gone very differently. So Richelieu, along with Anson, the British battleship, as well as the carrier Furious and a bunch of smaller ships, including, of course, HMAS Belfast, decided to wander up to the Norwegian coast. Furious would launch Seafires and Barracudas, and they would attack German shipping and a few shore installations if they could find any. The idea, obviously, was not to reveal their full force, but the idea was to provoke the Germans into sending either aircraft or ships or both after the mysterious attacking Allied force, and at the very least focus their attention on it, which of course meant if German aircraft and various cruisers were coming after Furious, then obviously Richelieu and Anson could utterly decimate them, And even if they didn't, well, hopefully the Germans' attention would be fixed on the goings-on, and so they wouldn't go after the convoy. Which, I mean, the Germans didn't send the cruisers out. They didn't send that many fighters out either. The Allies came away -1 sea fire, but +1 small German merchant ship sunk. So it was kind of a big effort that didn't accomplish all that much, to be perfectly fair. But hey, at least almost nobody died. Modern Gamer asks, could you go into detail of Enterprise's Admiralty Pennant Award? So at the end of the war, USS Enterprise had a few things to do, one of which was to pick up some US troops who, wanted to go home. And so she rocked up in the UK, because there were obviously a fair number of US troops in the UK, both based in the UK at that point, and having come back from Europe, who wanted to head back across the Atlantic, and she was part of Operation Magic Carpet, so on board they hopped. Meanwhile, the Admiralty was looking for a way to express the appreciation they held for obviously having fought alongside the US Navy for officially about 4 years. Unofficially, obviously, some American help even before their official involvement in World War II. And the Admiralty Pennant, which had up to that point never been awarded to a foreign warship, was obviously a very high honour. But who to give it to? Well, Enterprise was one of the very, very few US large vessels that had seen out the entire war. Not for lack of trying on the Japanese Navy's part, to be fair, but she was, along with Saratoga, the only US fleet carrier still standing from the start of the war. She'd seen a lot more action than Saratoga, because Enterprise tended to collect bombs, which were slightly easier to replace than Saratoga's habit of collecting torpedoes. And obviously Enterprise had also taken part in a lot of very decisive actions. So, long-lived, lots of service, several decisive battles. What better ship to award the Admiralty Pennant to than Enterprise? And so, and also she was there. So Enterprise got awarded the Admiralty Pennant in recognition of her extremely long and very welcome service assisting the Allied cause in World War II, and remains the only foreign warship to ever be granted that honour. So Long John asks, why do you think Bismarck had exposed fire control cables? A simple answer is, because she did. Now, the thing is, the fire control cables for Bismarck are, as with any other battleship, quite extensive, because you have to have fire control cables that go from the primary rangefinder station down to fire control. You also have to have cables going from the secondary fire control stations down to fire control, and then that data has to be distributed to the turret, so the cables have to then go from the central fire control station to the various turrets. And then, of course, you've got backup positions that have to be wired in as well, and in theory some redundancies. Now, some parts of that are armoured. Obviously, the cables can come up through the barbette, so that's armoured. From the secondary forward and aft fire control stations, for example, where Mülheim-Reichberg was in the aft station, those had armoured tubes that the cables could run down. And then, of course, you have the armoured deck, and the central fire control computer, etc., is positioned below there, so cables can run under the armoured deck there. Where Bismarck had exposed cables, and where this was marked up by the Allies as a weakness compared to their own designs, is further up. Now you can see here, shot looking up at the superstructure. Now, in both Allied and German ships, the fire control cables that led down from the primary rangefinder, and also radar, in some cases, depending on where it was mounted, in the lower part of the superstructure, those cables were in some kind of armouring, whether that be splinter-proofing or more substantial armouring, depending on the ship. However, once you start getting higher up, obviously any individual kilogram of weight has more and more effect on the ship's stability, because it's higher above the ship's centre of gravity. And So you have to make decisions about what happens. Are you going to keep an armoured trunking going all the way up to your uppermost fire control positions and or radar, or are you going to do something else? Now, on something like a King George V, a North Carolina, Iowa, South Dakota, etc., this was done by maintaining an armoured trunk. Okay, the armour's not particularly thick because, as mentioned, stability concerns, but it is at least splinter-proof and blast-proof. So the idea being that unless you scored a direct hit on what is still a relatively narrow trunk, the fire control cabling would survive and data could continue to be received from your primary range-finding devices, whatever they happen to be. And if you're ever lucky enough to go up the forward superstructure tower of an American fast battleship, you'll notice as the tower gets narrower and narrower and narrower that a constant feature all the way up is this tube that runs up the middle. So by the time you're in the upper reaches, there's basically 4 small compartments, and each of them has a quarter of a cylinder in it, right, which is this central tube that runs up the middle. When it got to the higher echelons of the superstructure, it appears from all investigation that Bismarck did not have this feature, instead relying on multiple cables that were not protected in order to presumably give some kind of degree of redundancy. This turned out to be a bad idea because, again, what appears to have happened, based on the wreck analysis and on the battle reports, is that when the shell came in that basically knocked out Lütjens and Lindemann, the first big hit appears to have actually hit the conning tower and splashed on it rather than punching straight through, although the conning tower was later punched straight through as well. Basically, that hit created enough blast and fragments that went up into the superstructure behind it that either by blast or by direct action severed all of the lines from the primary rangefinder, which meant that Bismarck was very early in the battle not necessarily rendered blind, but was left relying on secondary rangefinders like Mulheim-Reichberg Station, which were not as ideal because they're not as large, they're lower mounted, and therefore there's less fidelity to their data. Those stations fore and aft obviously got taken out later on, but given how long-range battleship gunnery duels are, I guess if you're talking in terms of actual sort of handheld firearms, if you imagine that a sniper, I mean, they wouldn't do this in real life, but imagine for a second that a sniper has his big high-power scope on his rifle, and he also has a side-mounted ACOG sight or something with maybe a 3 or 4 times fixed magnification on it. And basically what's happened is that due to not being properly protected, Bismarck very quickly loses that big 10, 15, 20 times zoom scope, and is now left trying to fight another bunch of people who also have similar scopes, except now it can only use this fixed relatively low magnification ACOG. It's not entirely relying on iron sights just yet, but it is a significant disadvantage, and that is basically what happens with Bismarck. And, as I said, the Allied analysis picked this up as a weakness. Now, as with everything to do with Bismarck, it is the subject of constant debate back and forth, but, it's something that was acknowledged at the time by the Allies as a weakness. It's something that a fair number of historians have picked up as a weakness, and of course some people will disagree. Some people have reasonable arguments about why, not necessarily why it was a good idea, but why it was reasonable that at the time the Germans did it, and other people are just convinced that Bismarck was made of unobtainium and God, so therefore can't possibly be wrong. But, well, enough about them. HMS Inadvisable asks, this might venture a little too deep into electrical engineering, but could you provide a high-level explanation of how returns from different radars of the same type on the same ship were differentiated? Was there an operational solution instead of a technological one, e.g. modulation, setting different frequencies, and so forth? So part of the solution was just not having quite as many radars of the same type on the same ship. I mean, even an Iowa class only has 4 Mark 37s. And also, you've got to bear in mind that these radars are highly directional. We think of the big rotating antenna on top for the air search radar, sure, but there's only one of those running at any one time on a ship, whereas for the Mark 37s, the antennas are, as I say, very fixed directional, so even if they're pointing at roughly the same air group, chances are the returns are not mutually overlapping. And even in a very unlikely event that they are, now I'm not 100% certain. This is kind of my interpretation of the manual for running the Mark 12 radar that was installed in the Mark 38 fire control system. But the way it talks about setting the radar up does actually seem to indicate that you are able to very slightly vary the modulation, because you have to align when you're starting the thing up. Obviously not in battle, but when you're calibrating it, you have to align the precise modulation of the transmitter with the receiver. So there is a degree of variation built into that. And so if everybody is, very carefully making their own transmitter-receiver frequency pairings, then it's unlikely that the two Mark 37 stations that are pointing in the same direction are going to have exactly the same frequency of transmission, and therefore they won't mutually interfere, which is obviously a good thing. When it comes to smaller radars, like, for example, the ones that you're starting to see integrated into Bofors mounts towards the end of the war, again, smaller, somewhat less powerful, and very directional. Those seem to be the main safeguards against mutual interference. And then, again, assuming that I'm interpreting those manuals correctly, some kind of slight variation on the frequencies of each individual radar due to the refinements of each crew setting it up probably helped secure against the last possible risks. But of course, if you happen to know the Mark 12 or the Mark 25 radar inside and out and have a slightly different answer, feel free to let us know. Kainoa Denford asks, I recently found a picture of my great-grandfather standing on a flat top with USS Langley 1922 written on the back. Now, as far as any of my living relatives know, he wasn't in the Navy but in the Merchant Marine. Would it have been common for sailors from the Merchant Marine to be on carriers back then, or was this something unusual? As a side note, his name was James T. Merck, so I think it would be hilarious if he'd ever set foot on the Enterprise. So from what I can tell, US Merchant Marine officers are also US Navy reservists, or very often are US Navy reservists. So given that 1922 was the year that Langley was recommissioned as a carrier, so for a good chunk of that time she would have been in Norfolk Navy Yard, and given, as I say, the close status between the US Merchant Marine and the US Navy, it would be entirely possible, I would imagine, for him, if he is indeed in the Merchant Marine, and the photos that you sent through do seem to support that, it would be entirely plausible for him to be on the deck of Langley, either potentially because maybe he had some specific skill that was helpful in her conversion or in her working up, and then as a reservist they might have said, right, well, we need your help. He may have just been in the area and wanted to have a look aboard. He may have known someone on the Langley who might have given him a bit of a tour around. But yeah, it's certainly entirely plausible that he was a Merchant Marine officer, but also would have been perfectly welcome aboard the Langley in the early 1920s. I mean, even these days, it is possible to get tours of active warships as a civilian. And back in the early 20s, there wasn't anything like the same level of security requirements, especially for someone whose day job was so closely aligned with the US Navy's rank structure and so forth anyway. So, whilst it wouldn't have been common for Merchant Marine sailors to just be wandering on and off of US Navy warships, it's certainly not unbelievable and entirely plausible. Jellicoe Cats Get Confused at Night asks, I have been thinking about the issues the US Navy is having with combining diesel and gas turbine engines on the Freedom-class LCSs. I was wondering if anybody ever looked at anything similar before, like say a 4-shaft cruiser with 2 diesel drivetrains for range and 2 geared turbines for additional speed in battle, and if not, why not? Are there innate technical challenges, or is this something that, like the battleship aircraft carrier, would only be worth the trade-offs if you were desperately short on fuel? If you were so desperately short on fuel, you had more important things to worry about. Yeah, they were tried in a number of different ships across a few nations. The most prevalent people to try and attempt it were the Germans. So this ship that you see here, Prince Regent Luitpold, was designed, unlike the other Kaiser-class battleships, to have her 2 outer shafts driven by steam turbines for speed, but a central diesel-powered shaft for cruising. As it turned out, the diesel engine wasn't ready in time, so she just went out as a 2-propeller vessel. But the Königsbergs and their subclass also had a centerline low-speed diesel propulsion for range, for cruising, coupled with higher speed turbines for moving quickly. Basically, it does offer certain advantages, as you've mentioned, in terms of long-distance cruising, but there are a number of disadvantages as well. For one thing, the fuel is not interchangeable, so it's entirely possible for you to run out of fuel for one set of your propulsion while still having fuel for the other, which could be inconvenient. For second, it means obviously you have to have 2 completely separated systems of fuel ducting from separate fuel tanks, which adds to complexity and weight. Thirdly, diesel engines of the period that the channel covers usually weren't that brilliant compared to steam turbines. And of course, it was a completely different set of maintenance requirements, just a completely different set of engineering skills required to run the 2 different power trains. So there were a lot of downsides to it, with the only real upside being, well, you might be able to go a little bit further at cruising speed. One of the other major problems was you, as I suppose is probably being experienced at the moment, you have problems trying to switch from one to the other. It's a lot more of an involved process than just switching from a high pressure to a low pressure turbine, which, as can be seen if you go to HMS Belfast, you can just turn around and say, okay, well, spin up the other turbine and engage the clutch and shift over the gears. And yes, that is definitely a thing. There's signs and levers and everything all over the place. So yeah, if you ever want to shift gear in a turbine powered cruiser, you best get it right, because crunching those gears is going to be expensive. Ivor Barkin asks, while Admiral King is very memeable and of course very important, the highest ranking naval officer in US service during the Second World War was William Leahy. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. Can you provide a quick review and analysis of his life? Leahy had a interesting life. He was a couple of years, well, figuratively speaking, a little more than that, ahead of Admiral King. So, for example, he saw direct service in the Spanish-American War, and subsequently in the next couple of decades would usually be found in some way, shape or form in most of the conflicts that the US was involved with between the Spanish-American War and the outbreak of World War I, or at least the American involvement in World War I, which he also would participate in. He seems to have been something that on the surface might seem to be a bit of a paradox, but actually under the surface, actually shows up quite often in some of the better officers, in that he seems to have been a very humanitarian person. He didn't like the idea of randomly bombarding civilians. He did like the idea of helping people out, and seems to have just been a generally fairly nice character, but also was a very staunch defender of the idea that if somebody stepped out of line and stepped on the interests of his country, that they should be punished for it. Which, to a certain extent, actually strikes me as a somewhat similar to Admiral Fisher's, again, on the surface of it, paradoxical, intense desire for peace, but, his desire for peace was expressed, at least in his mind, by making war as terrible a prospect as possible so that nobody would be stupid enough to try and engage in it. And the better naval officers certainly seem to have something of this kind of trait, where they actually quite like helping people. They don't like doing things they see as unnecessarily brutal, and ideally they want to have peace, but the minute somebody steps over the line into potentially threatening that peace on a large scale, they're actually quite in favour of very strong intervention immediately to forestall a potentially much larger issue down the line, which seems a fairly wise approach, at least to me. So he climbed the ranks. He was fairly good friends with President Roosevelt, and that's the 1930s one, and then basically topped out at the highest rank you could get in the US Navy, and then went off to do a few other things. So he was effectively no longer in active Navy service in terms of carrying a formal rank within the rank structure in day-to-day job just before the outbreak of World War One, World War Two, and so he ended up going off to do other things. So he served as the governor of Puerto Rico for a little bit. He then had the unenviable task of trying to bring Vichy France in line with American interests, which was a Sisyphean task, which didn't go particularly well. And so once America got directly involved in World War II, courtesy of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Lee was brought back in as the commander-in-chief of both the Army and the Navy. So bearing in mind, obviously, the US Air Force didn't exist as a separate entity at this point. It was the US Army Air Force. So Leahy was basically the supreme military officer in charge of everything, at least on paper. Theoretically, I mean, in practice, you had people like King and Marshall, who did a lot of the day-to-day stuff as the head of their respective services. But Lee helped, get everybody vaguely aligned and going in the right direction, obviously advising the president and the various other politicians on what should be done. You see him pop up an awful lot in various of the various important conferences as well. And yeah, he basically helped run the higher echelons of the US establishment throughout their involvement in World War II before obviously then surviving the war, going on to advise President Truman, and then retiring in 1948. Although that wasn't officially accepted until spring 1949, at which point he went into retirement. Well, technically as a 5-star, couldn't ever fully retire, and then he would pass away, actually, surprisingly enough, in 1959 at the age of 84. So unlike a lot of the high-ranking US officers, he actually survived a fair distance past the Second World War, which, considering that he was also one of the oldest of them, is pretty good going for him. Andrew Dederer asks, during World War I, was there any doctrine or orders for entering and or remaining near a geographical location or in confined seas? It seems that some areas were noted for their submarine danger, like Torpedo Alley near Guadalcanal and multiple contacts made far off the Marianas during the Philippine Sea. What was done to minimise the threat level once the enemy knew where you were operating? Well, yeah, there was one primary overriding doctrine when it came to entering or remaining near certain geographical features or confined waters. Don't, where you have a choice, precisely because it limits your options to manoeuvre, makes you much easier to find, and then the enemy can basically take you out like a fish in a barrel. If, however, you don't have a choice in the matter, then there's effectively a split in doctrine. Either you have to be fast and sneaky if you don't have many ships with you. So this is why night actions, destroyers and cruisers were quite often used in these kinds of environments. Or if you can't pull that off, i.e. you can't just pop in and out, then you have to fall back on the other half of the doctrine, which is go in with absolutely overwhelming firepower. Those are really the only two ways to minimize the threat level, because if you're either in a confined waters or you're tied to a particular geographic location by, say, having to support an amphibious landing or something like that, then you really, really are a bit stuck, because your enemy will have far more freedom of movement than you, and since they know where you are, they can come after you at a time and place of their choosing, and you have to be on the alert all the time. So, the whole thing of the defenders have to be lucky all the time, the attacker only has to be lucky once, pretty much applies. So at that point, you need to, as I said, either not be found or not be seen, or if you are going to be found or seen, have the ability to get out there really, really quickly. So you see things like this with the various actions off Guadalcanal, where destroyers and cruisers will go in, and submarines as well. They'll go in, they'll accomplish their mission, and they'll try and get out again as quickly as possible into a more open environment. Or if you are then going to, invade the Solomon Islands or Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Philippines, France, D-Day, etc., Operation Torch as well. Therefore, stealth and speed are somewhat out of the question. Then you just turn up with so much firepower, it doesn't matter if the enemy knows where you are, because ideally, if they come after you, you're just going to chew them up and spit them out regardless. But that obviously requires that you're not only that you have that doctrine, but that you have the ships and the aircraft, etc., to enforce that doctrine. And where things tend to go terribly, terribly wrong is where you end up with something that's not particularly sneaky, not particularly fast, and doesn't have the power to respond and counterattack enemy forces that come after them. And that's where you get a lot of disasters in these kinds of areas. Reichspear Minister asks, what were the main breach block types on the main guns of battleships from World War I to World War II? Why were those types chosen, and why, if even they were they changed in World War II, and to what type? And then could you give a few pros and cons of each? So at their core, fundamentally, the vast majority of battleship guns used one of two breach block types, and of that vast majority, the vast majority of the vast majority were of what are called the interrupted screw breach type, which you can see here. This can come in a variety of forms, a kind of a cone-shaped one, and you can have different numbers of strips of the interrupted screws. You can see here this one has quite a few. You can have one that's only got 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Subtle variations on a theme, but they are all pretty much the same principle. The other one, which is much in the minority, but is found mainly in the German fleet, but also found in a few other ships, especially when you're looking at the smaller guns, is the sliding breech block. Now, the interrupted screw breech block, well, as you can probably tell from the name and the diagram, relies on a series of screw threads, but they're not continuous spiral screw threads, they are interrupted. And the idea is that, obviously, this is a very, very finely machined piece of equipment. It usually opens on a hinge sideways, but you can, if you want, open it vertically or up or down. Don't know why you'd want to do that, but you can. Anyway, so once you've got your shell and your charges in there, then the whole thing, which is obviously you can see very finely shaped and only slots in one particular way, is then slotted carefully into the breech of the gun and is then rotated. And once it rotates to the point that those screw threads have fully aligned with the receiving threads in the breech, it forms a nice tight gas seal for the gun, and the gun can be fired. So one of the main advantages of this is that, especially if you're using one with multiple interrupted threads like you can see here, you don't actually have to turn that breech block very far at all in order to achieve a good gas seal. If you've only got a pair, then you have to turn the entire thing 90 degrees, which is a lot further than this kind of thing could do, which, one, obviously makes it quicker and to seal, quicker to unseal and therefore unload, but also means that, should something go dramatically wrong, it's much easier to fix it, to unpick it, than it would be on if the threads were considerably longer. It also has the advantage of relative compactness, because as you can see with the thing open, when the breech block is swung out, the width occupied by the entire gun assembly is not actually that much increased over when the breech block is closed. The sliding breech block, which, as I mentioned, you'd be found mostly in the Kriegsmarine, is theoretically a much simpler arrangement, and in very crude terms, it's literally just a rectangular slab of metal which slides across the face of the breech. Obviously, it is a bit more complicated than that. There are guides and runners and teeth and so forth, but you generally get the idea. And that seals in place, and that provides a gas seal. Now, the advantage of that, as you might take away, is simplicity. It doesn't require anywhere like the level of fine precision machining that you need for an interrupted screw breech block. They're both very precise items, but as you can probably appreciate, it needs a lot more time to get an interrupted screw breech block correct. So it's simpler, it's slightly easier to use, it's a very simple lever action to open and close it. There are, however, two big disadvantages to it. First is that, unlike the interrupted screw type, the sliding breech block doesn't provide as good of a gas seal when it's at battleship caliber. So this is one of the reasons why German guns had to use, and I say had to use, brass cartridges for the last stage of their charges, because the lip of the brass cartridge actually helped provide some of the gas seal. If they had used an interrupted screw breech block, they wouldn't need to do that. Now, obviously, you can make different arguments about how good or not it was to have brass cartridges, but the fact was that having the sliding breech block necessitated using them. The other problem was that if you slid them the conventional way, which was horizontally, which was what Krupp built, then you had to have this huge slab of metal that had to slide completely out of the way of the breech itself in order to allow you access to reload the guns, which meant that the width it took up was considerably more. And this is one of the reasons why, in fact, one of the primary reasons why something like Bismarck's 15-inch twin turrets were so large, because they had to have the space within them to accommodate these big sliding breech blocks, which occupied far more width than a hinged interrupted screw breech block. In terms of why they were chosen and why they changed, well, the interrupted screw breech block went a fair way back, as I say, in various forms, and the changes to it basically just involved it becoming easier to use. And the reason the Germans stuck with the sliding one was basically because that was what Krupp made, and so you went with that because Krupp didn't want to do anything else. And they also believed in doing it completely horizontally instead of vertically, which some sliding breech block guns in other navies, like the US Navy, did. They realized the issues involved and went, okay, well, we'll just turn it 90 degrees, have it slide up and down instead of left and right, and then the spacing is reduced. So that's basically your pros and cons for both, and no one really changed all that much. Everyone's very, very set in their ways for various obvious reasons. I mean, the interrupted screw breech block is still used today, so I think it's won most of the accolades in that respect. It's the dominant type anyway. So here endeth part 1. Let's see if the little experimental switch over to part 2 works. Hopefully it does. If not, let me know in the comments below. And if it doesn't work, I do apologise. But anyway, on to part 2. And questions hopefully will still be in the video description. See you there.